Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you might be at. Indian man walks into a bar in the Philippines with a tarsier on his shoulder. And the barman looks at them and he goes, "Wow, where do you get that?" "Oh, there's 1.3 billion of them in India," replies the tarsier. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Raju Mandhyan, and I'm happy, humbled, and honored to be here, part of this session on how to include and how to evaluate humor in your speeches. Now, we'll go through 5 major segments, modules. What is humor? What is the science and the art behind it? Kinds of humor, and some techniques on humor, like how do you put in humor? How do you make humor? How do you create humor? And then how to include that in a speech, like a 5-minute, a 7-minute, or 20-minute speech, how to put in humor there. And then, of course, how to deliver that material, that content, such that the quality of it is presented well and absorbed well and enjoyed well. Okay, that's what we'll do. So let's start with what is humor. Humor, in my opinion, has the same prefix as humility, human, humane, humble, what have you. Where I come from, India, where I am at right now, there's a family called the Tatars. They are quite similar to the Ayalas of the Philippines. And they're also foreigners into this country. They're not really ethnic Indians. And their faith is a faith called Zoroastrian. And they have 3 mottos to their lives. It's very simple. And I went to a Zoroastrian school. I know it. That's why I know it. Their motto in life is Humata, Hukata, and Huvrashta. Same prefix as humor, humble, humility, human. And Humata means good views of life, good mindset, good thoughts, Mata, how do you see things? Hukata is how do you translate things, how do you express things positively, constructively, and benignly, without creating harm. And the things you do must be conscientious, right? Good things, good effect, good impact, good outcomes. And that's all about humility and being human. And that's where the connection of humor and these values are. It's important. Humor is a really powerful tool for communication and, of course, for leadership. Many leaders across the world, you've read about them, Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, many others, President Ramos in the Philippines, Miriam Santiago Defensor in the Philippines, all used humor powerfully to get their points across and to drive change in their worlds. So in my opinion, humor is a powerful thing that you can upskill yourself with. That is humor. Now, what exactly is humor? Research in the 1950s by a gentleman called Stephen Leacock came up with this definition. And the definition, if I remember correctly, is humor is the kindly contemplation of life's incongruities and the artistic expression thereof. Life's incongruities. That means things that are odd, uneven, mismatched, or just not the usual average stereotype that people expect. And then kindly contemplation of them. Not unkindly, but kindly contemplation of them. And then the artistic expression thereof. So those oddities, those incongruities, or those not so average stereotype fit conformations, maybe in appearances, maybe in how people communicate, maybe in their behavior, or maybe in their physical appearances, or in their environment or their culture. So what humorists do is that they pick upon these differences, these variances, these extremes away from the average, and then they describe them artistically, nicely, in a very creative manner, such that people laugh. So if someone describes a very tall, slim man, or very short, fat person, and when they describe it, these are extremes. Right? And when you describe them in a very creative manner, then that becomes funny. That's the essence of humor. That is the definition of humor. Artistic expression of incongruities in life. That means when we mess up, you need to explain that in a fun way, in a creative way, and people laugh, and you create and generate humor. Laughter, of course, is the outcome of humor. Now, what happens at the brain level? The neuroscience behind humor. The science, how humor is conducted is just like the joke. Indian man walks into a bar in the Philippines with a tarsier on his head, on his shoulder, and the tarsier replies, "That's 1.3 billion of them in India." So the setup is Indian man walks into a bar with a tarsier on his shoulder, and the barman goes, "Hey, what's that? Where do you get that from?" So up until that, it's pretty logical, expected, normal conversation, and then suddenly the reply comes from the tarsier instead of the man, isn't it? So that's called the setup and a punch. And thus humor occurs through mental derailment. That's what it happens. And what exactly is mental derailment? Mental derailment is that when you see something, when you experience something, when you hear someone, you're kind of absorbing that logically in a systemic and a structured way. And then suddenly the answer, the outcome, or the connection between the two is totally different, unexpected, true, unexpected, related, but still unexpected. And that goes, "Oh, that's different." And people laugh. So that's it. That's what mental derailment is, logical thinking, setting up, and then suddenly dropping it with a response or a punch that's quite different, that comes from any different direction. And so the logic happens in our left brain, and then when you give a response or the punch, the answer comes from the creative side, the right side of brain. And because the neural synapse is far, there's a little pump up in the oxygen. And the pump up in the oxygen into your brain and into your system makes you release it like this. You go, "Ha!" And that is laughter. Quite scientific, but the truth, all right? So Dr. Patch Adams and many others did this research, and that now concludes the boring part of this event, of this conversation with you. Now, what are the kinds of humor? Kinds of humor is visual, verbal, physical, right? Physical is Laurel and Hardy, the Three Stooges, or many of those little sitcoms we have in the Philippines where people go bump, people fall off, and there's cake on your face, and you slip, and whatnot. Things fall on your head, and there's an odd combination of a couple, everything that is physical, like boom, it hits you, and it surprises you. A tickle, by the way, is physical creation of humor, right? You go ahead, poke your finger, and you go physical humor because you didn't expect a finger going up in that weird place in your armpit. Physical humor. Visual humor is appearances, two-dimensional. One of the better examples of visual humor is Mr. Bean. I'm assuming that most all of you grew up on Mr. Bean. No dialogues, no voice, a little music, and just physical humor. How does that happen? Bean is talking to someone and he's trying to shoot a dart or something or try to eat something. Meanwhile, his car in the background is driving over lots of people and other cars and stuff. And you go, this guy's not aware of it. And that creates for visual humor. So sometimes you have someone talking or doing something in the front and there's something else going on in the back. So there's a little visual discord, and then your brain has to adjust. Like someone's doing something in the front and something else is happening in the back, and it creates many mental synapses, neural synapses, and that creates humor. Now, coming to our favorite kind, spoken humor, verbal humor, jokes, funny stories, limericks, what have you. Those are all verbal humor. Actually, verbal humor is really most of the figures of speeches that we learned when we were in high school. Pun. Pun. An example of a pun is, I was wondering why the frisbee was getting bigger and then it hit me. Hear it again. I was wondering why the frisbee was getting bigger and then bang, it hit me. So the hit is, I got it, and bang, it banged on me, right? So that's a one-liner pun. Another pun, example of pun from the Philippines is about the president of the Philippines who once went to Chicago, and at the restaurant, he sat down and he ordered bacon and eggs, and the waiter asked him, would you like potatoes or mashed potatoes? And the president of the Philippines replied, mashed potato. And then when the waiter left, this was a fancy restaurant, and the sidekick of the president, he said, sir, ano po yun, sir? Potato tsaka mashed potato. And the president replied, you're stupid, you don't know that. And he pulled out his forearm, and he points to the front of his forearm, and he goes, potato. And then he holds it up back and he goes, mas potato. Again, pun involved, kind of low-end pun involved, but there you go. No? So that's verbal humor. Now, besides visual, verbal, and physical, in my opinion, the research or the content creation of humor is drawn from situations. That means things that happen and things that are odd, not normal, not abnormal, but not normal, things that don't happen often, a situation, an interaction, an incident on the street or anything, and you go, man, that was so funny, that was so crazy, that was such a riot. So Hollywood movies recently are mostly situational humor. If you watched Hangover, Part 1, 2, and 3, is mostly situational, scenes and scenarios, and of course there are characters and dialogues in it. No? So that's situational humor. In the Philippines, I know there's a gentleman in Alabang, I forget his name, and he's a situational humor specialist. He's a stand-up. You should look him up. When I remember his name, I'll send it to you. That's the first one. Then, of course, is observational humor. That means things you see. Situation is your part of it. You were included and then you explained it. Observational is things you see, tall and short, thin and fat. Sorry, that might be a bit politically incorrect nowadays, but you understand. I'm just trying to explain humor. It could be a person who's vertically abled and a person who's vertically disabled, or a person who is laterally challenged, horizontally challenged, and person who is horizontally happy, thick and thin. No? I hope I don't get sued for this. So observational, and then verbal humor, of course, was pun. Pun, exaggerations, understatements, euphemisms, ironies, sarcasm. So situational, observational, and then all of these put together, they come into two categories. Actually, one is self-deprecating and the other one is other-deprecating. Self-deprecating is that when you find those incongruities within yourself. within your own appearance. Gray hair, thinning hair, long nose, right? And double cheeks. These are flaws you find within yourself. Hair on your ears, hair in your nose, what have you, your waistline, your fingers, etc., if they are out and far away from the ordinary. Self-deprecating, so you pick on your physical appearances. Or second level of self-deprecation is when you pick on how you communicate. My Indian accent or my Filipino accent, one of the two, whichever works for you. Or my Australian friend who says, good eye. If you want it, you need to pay, whatever. So verbal or about how you communicate or how you sound and the things you say, right? So self-deprecating about your appearance, about your communication, and also about your attitude and your beliefs. Now that's a bit of a challenge because attitudes and beliefs are not so visible to others unless you explain them well, no? So it could be, you could be obsessive compulsive, or you could be, what are the other psychosis? You could be a kleptomaniac. You could be a claustrophobic, like I am. No? So again, that's not visible outright, but it has to be explained, and you could make fun of that. And then, of course, culture, environment, your family, etc. You can spread and you go far, but it's all about yourself. That's self-deprecating. So, for example, if a gentleman called Rene, who considers himself not to be extremely handsome, who considers himself to be way below average, and then when he talks about it, and he jokes about it, he laughs about it, then that becomes self-deprecating humor. But if I, Raju, were to talk about Rene, and I would talk about how not handsome he is, and how he's way below average, close to ugly, then that would be insulting. That would move into the arena of other deprecating. So when you talk about other people's appearances, you talk about other people's communication. So if you are English and you talk about the funny accent of the Indian, then you are becoming insulting, isn't it? But if the Indian talks about it, then it's fine. So other deprecating is making fun of others. It's almost close to insulting them, being sarcastic, being mean, demeaning. It can be done if you do it with the right attitude, with the right benign intention to just laugh rather than put down. And we'll probably get to that when we look at the 4 model speeches. We're all going to look at them, aren't we? So other deprecation, when you talk about others' culture, or attitude, value, behaviors, of course, their appearances, that would be other deprecating. So there we go. So deprecating, self and other is one kind, visual, verbal, 3. So basically, in my opinion, you can create humor through these 3 avenues. Now, what are the techniques? How exactly do you create humor? Setup, punch, mental derailment. So for example, hate, I have a technique in my book, The Heart of Humor. That's a little plug over there. Hate your likables. That means there are things about you that you like. Nice eyes, nice build, proper shoulders, etc. And you like them. In fact, they are in all appearances average, in fact, nicely above average. So you could get plus points for your looks, for your physics, for your physical appearance, for your physiology. And when you talk about them, this is self-deprecating. When you talk about them as if they're not so good, as if you hate them. You hate your likables. For example, not nowadays, but when I was younger, people would love my nose. Have a look. Yeah? Don't look that good before, but it used to look good. So here's it. I hate my aquiline nose because whenever people look at it, they feel like hanging clothes from it. You with me? I hate something that may have been good and then you give it a little weird kind of a situation to it. People feel like hanging clothes on it, right? So that's the first technique. That means you take something you like and make it sound as if you hate it, and then you exaggerate the dislike of it, and that becomes funny. This is self-deprecating. So hate your likables. Now, the second technique is quite the opposite of that, and that is love your unlikables. Right? Love your unlikables. I don't like my hair. I used to like it, but it's disappearing. You with me? It's going away. It's forever. It's leaving the country. It's leaving the world. Soon, in a matter of years, you'll see a nice bald spot. So, now, I don't like that, right? But here's the trick. I love my little squeezy, mousy hair because to brush it is a piece of cake. I don't spend on shampoo or brush it. All I do is walk into the shower, walk out of it, and just shove it back, and there you go. I have this lovely head of hair. So, again, so that's underplaying it, right? That's loving your unlikables. The third technique, a simple technique, very popularly used by humorists, is the good news, bad news technique. You probably heard of it. So here's an example of a good news, bad news technique. Doctor to a patient. Of course, it's a joke. It's not from my personal life. So it is an observation. It's something that I've read. Doctor to a patient in bed. The bad news, my friend, doctor to patient, is that we had to cut off your feet because they stank. I'll repeat that. We had to cut off your feet because they were stinking like hell. The good news, my friend, is that someone's made a fantastic offer on your shoes. Bad news is that we had to cut off your feet. The good news is that somebody's buying your shoes for $1 million. Okay? Good news, bad news. Now, the respondent or the victim of that humorous statement or joke, of course, is in pain. And he goes, what? My feet are gone, but $1 million? So again, that creates fun. So I'm going to do just these three techniques. I want you to become aware of that. And most speakers, most stand-up comedians, most television show hosts, they use these techniques constantly. In fact, people spend hundreds and thousands of dollars to be able to master these techniques or to experience them. So, for example, you are probably conversant with The Tonight Show. The Tonight Show is currently hosted by a young guy, I can't remember his name, but before him there used to be Jay Leno, and before him there was Johnny Carson, and they get really paid well for every night of a night of humor and fun. 30 to 40 minutes, if I remember. And Tonight Show has been around for 50 years. So the host, who's a great deliverer of humor, and he kind of manages, is impromptu, he improvises, and he's quick on his feet. And so he gets a lot of money for being the show host. But he has a staff of writers, humor writers, every single day, who gather material from different parts of the world, from politics, from news, etc., and they convert them into one-liners and they weave it into his presentation, his chit-chat every evening, and it's full of current, relative, updated humor. And so if he has 50 to 100 people and he himself works on it the whole day for a 40-minute show, these people work like a factory to create that humor. So do all other comedians and humorists across the world. It's good business. And at this stage, I do want to mention humor is not as easy as storytelling. Storytelling is not as easy as giving a business presentation. That's why business presentations or leadership presentations require stories and require humor, because they are a lot more difficult, they are a lot more challenging, they call for a lot more effort on the part of the deliverer. And the reason they are a lot more challenging is because they create really powerful engagement. So when you tell a story like I'm doing, higher engagement. Humor, much higher engagement, because what humor does, of course, it pumps up oxytocin into your brain. It's dopamine. And then when dopamine pumps up into your brain and you're in a community, it builds relationships. You kind of charm people, and you're charmed by people who laugh and tell stories. That's why public speakers, or even professional paid speakers like yours truly, we struggle with humor. Many of us are afraid of it. We stay away from it, because when you don't do it well, you kill, you screw up, you mess up really royally. Because again, humor and comedy are two sides of a coin. Pain and happiness, like pain and gain, are two sides of a coin. Tragedy and comedy are two sides of a coin. So humor, actually, when you say deprecating or situational or observational, because it is about extremes, it does hurt a certain person, a certain community, a certain entity, a certain belief or a behavior. And then when it makes fun of it, it does cause pain. So think of it. Indian man walks into a bar with a tarsier on his shoulder. I'm insulting 1.3 billion Indians. They could come after my blood, right? Thankfully, I happen to be one of them, so I can hide in the crowds and they won't know who did it, right? Etc., etc. So, etc., etc. So across the world, there are Polish jokes, there's Visayan jokes, and I'm not going to mention many more in the Philippines or in India, because I will really be dead. So people pick on these communities who are slightly different. So very important, leadership, and that's the power. Now, get it? So we've covered what humor is, what's the science behind it, the kinds of humor. And of course, when I say kinds of humor, there's also dark humor, there's political humor, that's sexual humor, and there's a doctor in the Philippines, I forget his name, ear, nose, and throat doctor, and he's a speaker, and he calls it holy humor, Holey. That means humor about ear, nose, mouth, etc., etc. Not so good. I don't like it. Scatological, I stay away from it. I prefer situational and verbal humor, play of words. So now, how do you build a 7, 10, 15, 20, 1 hour presentation with fun in it? Delivering humor. Extremely important. Before I tell you about delivering humor, when you understand humor, you begin to look for it. You become addicted to it, and then you gather material, then you practice it, and you become good to it. Now, how do you deliver humor? So let's say about delivering of humor is, number one is proper place. You have to be careful. Context, If you're in a place where people are kind of mourning something, you have to be cautious with your humor. It is useful. It's strong medicine when at a wake. It's really strong medicine. In fact, many of the wakes I've attended, at the end of 3, 4, 5 days, people begin to laugh. But in the beginning, no. In the hospitals, sometimes no. But if you can, if you're good, if you're a samurai of humor, then that's powerful medicine. So proper place. Proper timing. Sometimes people are preoccupied, they're concerned, and they're studying, analyze something to find solutions. And if you kind of be funny, stupidly funny, then you can cause pain. If you're careful, then you can use humor as a medicine and to resolve or to dissolve the tension, to diffuse the tension. You can do that. One time I was at a business meeting where there were people from different races, ethnicities, Asians and Westerners, and one of the leaders of the group was sitting there and he said, Asians are not as good as Westerners when it comes to public speaking. Hugely insulting. And I was sitting there and I'm like half Asian, like Asian by birth and ethnicity, by an appearance, maybe I'm a little bit Puerto Rican. And there was a couple of Westerners who found this also offensive. And suddenly the whole meeting went quiet. And I said, well, this is not going to progress. The guy made a mistake, right? He messed up. So I slowly began to bring in laughter, just a joke at a time, and then I diffuse the situation. So it works like that. So proper timing is important, right? Proper timing to create humor. Now, within a presentation, when you do a stand-up, what do you call that, a skit? Or I forget what this, a stand-up, do you have a piece? They call it a stand-up piece. Or a presentation. You have to have a singular theme. Now, in business presentations, of course, you have a singular theme, but in stand-up comedians, they have very crooked theme. It goes all around, it goes back and forth. And that's why stand-up comedy is way much more fun than a basic humorous speech. But stand-up comedy can be harmful, it could be unkind, it could be vulgar, bastos, So we don't have to go there, we have to stay on the good, clean, benign, the humata, hukata, hurashta kind of humor. So we have to stay on the clean side. So you have to have a singular theme. And that means from a starting point to the ending point, there has to be a certain sense. People need to kind of attach the humorous scenarios, observations, the verbal humor, the feeling humor, attach it and relate it to the same theme. It has to be current. It has to be something that they can understand. For example, if I tell a funny story based out of London, nobody would understand. But if I create a story or a theme or a piece related to incidents and situations in the Philippines, people can relate to it. People can understand and they laugh. For example, hang on just a minute, my camera is kind of tilting. There you go, it's back. So, for example, back in the day, in England, there was an archery contest. And they put a boy against the tree and they put an apple on his head. And along came the first archer in blue tights, really tight blue tights. He picked up the bow and arrow, he took aim, and bang! He shot the apple in the center. Then he turned around to the crowd and he said, I am William Tell. Clap, 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 clap. Along comes a second archer in green tights. He picks up the bow and arrow, takes aim, and zoop! He hits the first arrow in the back and splits it into two. Then he turns around to the crowd and he says, I am Robin Hood. Along comes Michelangelo Chua in tight pink tights, really tight pinks. And he very daintily comes up to the bow and arrow and he picks it up with difficulty. He takes aim and he can hardly hold it and then he shoots it and zip, it hits the boy in the eye. Then he turns around to the crowd and he says, I am sorry. So, that's a lot of setup and then a punch. Lots of visual humor. Now, not very funny for people who don't know who William Tell was. Robin Hood, you've heard. Fun for people who, of course, know Michelangelo Chua. All right? So good timing, good pausing, and that's how you structure it. No? So it has to be appropriate humor, benign as I mentioned, correct timing. Humor requires a lot of practice, huge amounts of practice, huge amount of rewriting until you kind of tighten up the whole system. It doesn't have to have scientific research. It's situational, observational, visual, verbal, etc., etc. So now look at the speeches that are going to be shown and understand what kind of humor is the presenter making. How nicely has he weaved in the jokes and the little visual images, and what's his delivery mode? Is his mood happy? Is he enthused? Is he kind of bland, or is he really playing it deadpan? That's a good way to do it if your content is really good. So study it, and there's a cheat sheet provided in the handouts, and then assess, evaluate the other speeches, and then make humor your life. And I want to end this with a quote. I hope this has been clear and good for you. We covered what is humor, we covered kinds of humor, humor techniques, humor in speech, and how to deliver humor, right? Whole body, visual, verbal, you gotta put yourself in, and it has to be fun. You must be enjoying it, even though you wanna do it deadpan. You must be enjoying it, even if you wanna do it deadpan, all right? Trust me. So, I wanna end, laugh, and the world laughs with you. Cry, and you only get wet. Good afternoon, have fun, and God bless you. My name is Raju Mandhyan. Adios, amigos.